along the posterior aspect of the diaphragm and end up in the abdomen, where they synapse in these clustered ganglia around the major arteries that supply the abdominal viscera, and then the postganglionics go from these ganglia surrounding the central aortic ganglia, around the crushing on the front part of the abdominal aorta, and then travel with the arteries to the organs of the abdomen, which we'll get to in a minute. So this is the left side of the posterior mediastinum. There's our vagus again. And on the back side, obviously, is the esophagus, surrounded by the esophageal plexus. So your right and left vagus come down, and then they sort of split up into this plexus that wraps around the esophagus. And also lying, here's the other side, called the red side, because you've got the descending aorta. And there's the thoracic aorta, the accessory hemiazygos, which ultimately ends up in the esophagus. Greater splanchnic nerve. Yeah, one of these splanchnics going down to the abdomen. And then there's another splanchnic. And there, way back up here on the back wall, like usually between the aorta and the esophagus or somewhere down there, is the thoracic duct, which you'll remember from Dr. White. Anyway, yes, from Eric's lecture, picks up all the lymph from the lower part of the body and the thoracic region, and carries it up into the neck where the thoracic duct empties. And I have another left slide. And there's our two vagi. There's our esophagus and esophageal plexus. Okay, so in the mediastinum, we obviously have the phrenic nerve from C345, okay, which is going to the diaphragm. The vagus nerves, and they have various branches going to the organs of the diaphragm. They go to the heart, they go to the lungs. You have sympathetic trunks running down the sides of the thoracic vertebrae. And then you have these splanchnic nerves that come off of thoracic level vertebrae, but they're preganglionics that are going to travel down and go into the abdomen. And the innervation going to lungs and heart and things, they sort of mix it up in these plexuses, so you can't really find the vagal fibers or visceral sensory fibers, or the sympathetics going to the individual bits of heart in the lung. There's always the plexus in the mediastinum that makes its way into these major organs. We then moved on to the abdominal wall, which has three big flat muscles, right? An external oblique, an internal abdominal oblique, and then a transversus abdominis. And they originate high up on the ribs and posterior surface of the thoracic and abdominal region. But then they come together in the midline, along this midline of the area known as the linea alba. And they have different ways in which they wrap around this vertical muscle, the rectus abdominis. So down low, between the pubic and halfway between the pubis and the belly button, the aponeuroses of all these abdominal obliques travel in front of the rectus abdominis fibers, so that the only thing forming the posterior sheath of this is the transversalis fascia. You can see that arcuate line where it goes from nothing in the back to a posterior rectus sheath. Around the middle area, the external oblique stays in front, the transversus abdominis goes in back, and the internal oblique has it both ways. Part of it goes in front, part of it goes in back, so that the rectus abdominis is enclosed in a sheath. And running along the back surface of it, okay, are these inferior epigastric arteries and veins, which are going to anastomose with the superior epigastric arteries and veins, which are coming down from above. Okay, lots and lots of organs we spent time. Here's a little liver, gallbladder, stomach. Okay, and here's the greater omentum. Okay, and here's the hepatogastric ligament and the hepatoduodenal ligament. And there's the lesser omentum. This area in here, right? We dissected, right over here, we dissected out all the structures going into the liver. Core cortex catus. Dug out this hepatoduodenal ligament and found the portal, hepatic portal, cystic artery and the hepatic artery, forming common bile duct, and then the various other structures in there. Stomach has lots of parts, esophagus, and then where the esophagus joins the stomach, it's called the cardiac region. Big bulge up here is the fundus, the body, the pyloric canal, the pyloric sphincter is there, and it opens up into the duodenum. The lesser curvature and the greater curvature. There are arteries traveling to the lesser curvature, and a series of arteries with greater curvature. Duodenum has 4 parts. 1, 2, the vertical part. 3, the lower horizontal part. And 4, this other ascending where it joins with the jejunum. And sitting in the curvature of the duodenum is the head of the pancreas. And the pancreatic duct opens into the second part of the duodenal filament, along with the common bile duct, which is coming down from above. So it goes into the second part of the duodenum, and this duodenal filament that you identified inside. The duodenum opens into the small intestine, which has the rest of the small intestine, which has a jejunum and an ileum, and there's 20 feet or so of sort of loopy stuff wrapping all around the major area of the central part of the duodenum. And these have a number of characteristic features. There are these vasorecti, these long arteries that go from the main arterial supply into the jejunum. There are fewer little arcades, so there are these loopy things here and then these straight things called vasorectums. The jejunum has long vasorecta but short arcades. It tends to be redder. It's got more, with these bigger, longer arteries, it's got more vascular tear going to it. There's a lot more absorption taking place in there. A thicker wall, so when you look on the inside of the wall, there's a lot more surface anatomy in there. In contrast with the last part, the ileum, which is the reverse. It has smaller, shorter vasorecti, fewer of them actually, but much bigger, these loops, these arcades. So it has less blood going to it. It doesn't tend to be as dark red. And a thinner wall. And if you look on the inside, there's less surface area there for absorption, but much more lymphatic stuff going on. And the ileum empties into the large intestine right here at the ileocecal junction. And there's the cecum, this sort of dead end, at the beginning of the large intestine, or the colon, and dangling off of it is the appendix. There's the ileocecal junction, little appendix, and then there's an ascending part over here on the right-hand side. Right colic flexure, a transverse colon across here, goes to the left colic flexure, and then a descending colon, then the sigmoid colon where it loops around, and then the rectum, the vertical rectum. And the large intestine is characterized by a number of sort of characteristic structures running along the length of the large intestine are these tinea coli, these 3 elastic sort of bands that run the whole length. And in contrast with the jejunum and the ileum or the duodenum, the large intestine is not sort of smooth. It doesn't look like a tube. Rather, it's got all these little pouchy things known as haustra, and dangling off of it are these little fatty globules known as omental epiphyses. Big liver, the largest single organ, if you don't count the skin in the body, and there's a series of ligaments. This falciform ligament attaches it to the front wall of the abdomen. There's a little gallbladder poking out here with a giant right lobe, a smaller left lobe. If you flip it over, you've got a caudate lobe up high, quadrate lobe down distally, and sitting next to the quadrate lobe is the gallbladder. There's little ligament teres of the gall, which goes is the bottom of the part of the falciform ligament, which goes out towards the umbilicus. There's your gallbladder. And go back a couple more. A couple more. Okay, so realize that this part of the liver is covered by peritoneum, just as you have pleura, visceral pleura and parietal pleura in the lungs. In the abdomen, you have visceral peritoneum and parietal peritoneum, but then there's this upper area of the liver where the liver tissue is lying right up against the underside of the diaphragm, which is known as the Bayer area. Okay, as I said before, the blood supply to the abdominal organs comes from 3 unpaired arteries. They come right off the abdominal aorta. They don't have right and left. They have a bunch of parts going in different directions, but there's the celiac trunk going to the liver and stomach and spleen and upper part of the duodenum, superior mesenteric going to part of the pancreas and part of the duodenum, but mostly to jejunum and ileum, and ascending colon and transverse colon, and then the inferior mesenteric, which is going to the descending colon and the sigmoid colon and rectum. So there's the celiac trunk with all of its branches. There's a big splenic branch going over here to the spleen, which I haven't talked about, sitting on the left-hand side. The left gastric going to the lesser curvature, and then a common hepatic is going to split into right and left hepatics. Well, common hepatics can give rise to the hepatic and gastroduodenal, and the hepatic proper is going to split to right and left, and also this little guy, which is the right gastric, which also does here. Going to get its own name eventually. And then the gastroduodenal comes down here and sends the superior pancreatico-duodenal things, and the right gastroomental, and coming off the splenic is the left gastroomental, and they supply the greater curvature of the stomach, and there's the veins to match. Superior mesenteric, like I say, sends some to the pancreas and part of the duodenum, and then lots and lots and lots of intestinal branches going to the jejunum and the ileum, a little branch going up to the transverse colon, and then a branch that comes off to the ascending colon. The branch goes to the junction between the ileum and the cecum, and a little bitty bit going to the kidneys if it happens to be there. And here's the inferior mesenteric, which is going to the left side. Okay, so it sends branches of inferior, well, it sends branches to the left side, the descending colon, which is the left colic branch, sends branches to the sigmoid colon, and then has a superior rectal branch that goes down to the rectum. The unusual thing about the abdominal viscera is that their veins don't go into the inferior vena cava, which is the big vein on the right side of the abdominal cavity, which is going up and going into the heart, going into the right atrium of the heart, but rather the blood from these abdominal organs, particularly those digestive ones, obviously, like the stomach, the intestines, and the colon, they all go into something known as the hepatic portal vein. So all this blood from stomach and intestines and spleen get picked up, travel up the posterior part of the abdominal cavity, and go into the liver, where they pass through liver tissue and are filtered. All the food is going to ultimately, well, the stuff that might be in your blood, that might have toxin, there might be alcohol or all sorts of horrible things. They've got into your digestive system, so it passes through the liver where it gets filtered out before it goes into the heart to get passed on to the brain and other organs. And needless to say, say, there are places where this area, well, this portal system, which is lying on the back of the abdomen, can have problems. So, you know, you could have some liver disease, so the blood doesn't go through the liver as well as it should, or you might have tumors or something down here. So it turns out there are places where the portal system is in close contact with veins that aren't going through the liver, what's known as the cable system, and these are known as the portal systemic anastomoses. So these include the lower part of the esophagus, where the esophagus is getting its venous drainage going into the hemiesophagus and ultimately the esophagus vein. But if their liver's jammed up and there's a high pressure in the portal system, blood can backflow from here and go up the esophagus to get into the esophagus system. Because the portal system is unusual among veins in that it does not have any valves, so blood can flow this way back into the liver, or it can flow back the other way. Another place of these anastomoses is the umbilical region. Another one is the rectum, where the superior part of the rectum has the veins go into the portal system. The middle and lower part, they go into the inferior vena cava, so blood can backflow through there. It will lead to where sort of hemorrhoid, but not really, slightly different. Okay, and these show these. And then there are on the side walls where the parts of the descending colon or the ascending colon are retroperitoneal, their blood is draining into the portal system, but the posterior abdominal wall drains into the vena cava, so blood can backflow there. So this is an important a series of anastomoses between the two areas, blood supplies that are draining the lower part of the body. Again, we talked about how the lungs have their visceral pleura stuffed up against the parietal pleura of the thoracic wall, and there's a similar situation in the abdomen where you have the peritoneum, which has visceral peritoneum surrounding the organs and parietal peritoneum lining the cavity. But some organs are within this the lungs, for example, are in the pleural cavity, right? They fill visceral cavity, and many of the abdominal organs are in